That morning, Carla Wilhite woke up and the horrific scene that she discovered would haunt her for the rest of her life and devastate the local community forever. Whilst you are here, make sure you hit the subscribe button. It will only take you a second and it means that we can carry on bringing episodes from the Kill Room. On today's episode, we are taking a look at the 1977 Girl Scout Oklahoma murders. Camp Scott, located in Locust Grove, lies 40 miles east of Tulsa, Oklahoma. From 1928 to 1977, it was used as a retreat for Girl Scouts and Brownies. Over 400 acres of beautiful woodland donated by the Scott family, once accommodating 140 campers and 30 members of staff. The campsite was abandoned following the horrific murders of 3 children. The story is not only tragic but baffling, and although much of the evidence points towards the original suspect, the contradicting stories and evidence leave us wondering about the involvement of another suspect who is barely mentioned in most of the news stories surrounding the case. On Monday, the 13th of June 1977, at around 6 a.m, Carla Wilhite woke up and she was excited to be starting her very first day as a counsellor at the age of just 18 years old. As Carla headed towards the showers, she spotted 3 sleeping bags about 100 metres into the woods. As she moved closer to investigate, she saw the corpse of 10-year-old Doris Milner lying on top of one of the sleeping bags, face up and naked from the waist down. She immediately ran for help from 2 other counsellors to discover that tent number 8 was empty. The camp director, Barbara Day, quickly arrived with her husband, Richard. The other 2 sleeping bags were unzipped to tragically discover the bodies of 2 further children, those of 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer and 9-year-old Michelle Heather Goose. The highway patrol were called and it was quickly determined that all 3 girls had been brutally murdered. It was later discovered that Lori and Michelle had both been raped and murdered in their tent before being put back into their sleeping bag and dumped in the woods. Doris was anally raped and bludgeoned to death with injuries on the back and side of her head, and these injuries indicated that she was most likely murdered while she was lying with her back or standing with her back towards the killer. One report says Lori was strangled and Michelle was beaten to death, whilst another report says both Lori and Michelle were strangled. Understandably, the parents of the 3 victims wanted to avoid any form of limelight, so we only give a little bit about their background that we could find that were freely given in interviews with the media. Lori was the eldest of 5 children, exceptionally intelligent with an IQ of 130 in 2nd grade, which is the UK equivalent to year 3. This was her first summer camp. Her parents very bravely made a few appearances on documentaries as they wanted the truth to be heard. Her mother, Cherie, became a strong advocate for families of victims and helped with Marsy's Law, an act that protects and expands the legal rights of victims of crime to include 17 rights in the judicial process, including the right to legal standing, protection from the defendant, notification of all court proceedings and restitution, as well as granting parole boards far greater powers to deny inmates parole. However, the amendment was deemed unconstitutional in 2017 and voided. Information on Michelle's background is very sparse. She was born on the 22nd of July in Miami, Ottawa County. Her father, Richard, helped to found the Oklahoma Crime Victims Compensation Board and helped the state legislature pass the Oklahoma Victims Bill of Rights. Doris was born on the 5th of February 1967 in Locust Grove. She was very intelligent with a wide range of interests and a bright future ahead of her. She was enrolled in a school for the gifted. Her mother Denise avoided the media as much as possible, so we decided to respect her privacy and leave out any other information that we found. Some of the parents attempted to sue for negligence but lost the case. Many consider that the various occurrences that happened before the murders indicate that the murders could have been prevented had the counsellors just paid more attention. Let's take a look at the details of the night before. The 3 girls were in a tent slightly apart from the rest of the group, out of view from the counsellor's tent and obscured by the shower block. A thunderstorm had struck that night and the girls had been writing letters to their parents whilst chatting late into the night. At some point before 10 p.m. on June the 12th, 1977, the counsellor of Comanche Camp saw a light heading north towards Kiowa Camp, but she did not know what it was. Then at 10 p.m, the elder made a camp check of Kiowa subcamp and was satisfied that everything was fine. 2 hours later, at around midnight, Carla Wilhite escorted some of the girls from the toilet back to their tents. The girls in Tent 6 were warned by Carla to stop making a noise at 1:30 a.m, and at the same time, Carla heard a strange noise coming from behind the tents. The sound was described as a low, guttural sound, but Carla was not sure if it was the sound of an animal or human. And when she shone her torch in the direction of the sound completely stopped. She returned to her tent to sleep, but the sound continued intermittently. Around 3 a.m, there are 2 reports of girls being woken by noises. One report is of a single scream and the other is of a girl crying out for her mother. Around the same time, someone was moving through Kiowa Camp and reaching into people's tents and stealing items, purses and even prescription glasses. The last story from a surviving witness comes from the girls in Tent 7. They described how the tent flap was peeled back and a man shone a torch onto them. Then a few seconds later, he closed the flap and he moved on to tent number 8. Earlier in April 77, a camp counsellor had discovered that her belongings had been ransacked and donuts had been stolen. And in replace of the donuts, somebody had left a letter. And that letter stated, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. The director of that camp session treated the note as a prank and it was discarded. Later, this would be used by some of the parents to claim negligence when they attempted to sue, but lost the case. Now let's talk about the murder scene. Harold Berry was the first police officer to arrive at the scene, and he discovered boot prints leading from the victim's tent all the way to where the victims' bodies were found. Further investigation reveals that the killer had made his way through the rear of the tent by unhooking the back flaps and making his way in. Blood spatter revealed that Laurie and Michelle were murdered in their tents. The killer had attempted to clean the blood by using bed sheets. The only fingerprint found was left on a torch, but that was smudged. It's unclear if the sexual assault took place before or after the murders. Doris had been gagged and walked over to the murder scene before she was gagged, sexually assaulted and murdered. A crowbar, rope and duct tape were also found at the scene, along with a note that stated, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. Hair discovered on the duct tape was never connected to the victims nor to the assumed killer. Perhaps the hair on the duct tape was from a previous victim, or could it have potentially been connected to a second killer? That remains a mystery. There were 2 different types of knots used, and autopsies show that the weapons used to strike the girls were used with both the left and the right hand. The rope and the duct tape belonged to a farmer called Jack Schroff. His farm was around 1 mile away from the camp. He took a lie detector test and he had a solid alibi, so he was never considered a suspect in the case. The main suspect was Gene Leroy Hart, who at the time of the murders was 34 years old. He was also at large from Mayes County Jail after escaping in 1973. Hart was raised about a mile from Camp Scott and he was a Native American Cherokee. Although Hart was known locally as a great athlete and a football hero, he was actually known by the police for his criminal behaviour. In 1966, he abducted 2 pregnant women outside a nightclub and he drove them to a forest in Mayes County and raped them. He had been convicted of kidnapping, the rape of 2 women and 4 counts of first-degree burglary. The women were bound with duct tape and rope. After the rapes, in an attempt to murder them, he closed off their noses and mouths with duct tape and left them in the forest to die. Fortunately, the women managed to free themselves and raise the alarm. They described Hart as being incoherent during the rapes and that he also made strange growling noises. A possible link to the strange noises heard coming from Tent 8 on the night of the murders. Another link to the scout camp was the fact that the glasses were stolen because a former inmate had told police that Hart would constantly steal glasses. Hart had bad eyesight and instead of getting a prescription for glasses, he would steal them whenever he could. In 1973, Hart escaped prison by sawing through the bars of his window. Hart eventually admitted to the rapes and burglaries, and he was sentenced to prison for 305 years because he attempted to evade the trial and he also attempted to kill his rape victims. And whilst he was on parole, he committed even further crimes. Hart was first linked to the camp murders when a cave was discovered nearby with some red underwear and sunglasses that were stolen from a camp leader. Also in the cave was a photograph of two women that a prison guard had taken and developed, and that prison guard worked in the very prison that Hart was once held in. A newspaper found in the cave matched some torn newspaper that was placed in a flashlight to reduce the batteries from rattling to make a sound so the killer could not be heard, and that flashlight was found at the murder scene. The lens of the flashlight had also been partially covered to dull the beam. There was a message engraved on the wall saying 77617, the killer was here, bye bye fools, and that was a date format commonly used by prison systems. For the fact that Hart had managed to escape jail and evaded Sheriff Weaver led many to believe that there was a personal vendetta to connect Hart to the murders. It was suspected that the Cherokee community were helping Hart to evade capture. At the time of the manhunt, Angie Jake, who was the editor of the Tulsa Indian News, said Hart had pulled the wool over their eyes for so long and he frustrated them, so when his name popped up, they blamed it on him. Ross Swimmer, the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation in 1977, said these people were acting emotionally, simply trying to help out a fellow Cherokee. Fears grew that Hart was being framed for the murders as rumours were spreading that the OSBI were planting evidence to convict him. It was also found that sperm was found in the semen evidence and Hart had had a vasectomy. However, it transpired that the vasectomy Hart had had was unsuccessful. In 1989, DNA testing technology had advanced and it had shown that 3 of the 5 probes were Hart's DNA. And it's unknown if the 2 remaining probes were impossible to test or perhaps if they pointed towards a second killer. Eventually, the police found Hart hiding with a Cherokee called Sam Pigeon. Members of his tribe claimed the police were trying to pin the murders on one of their people. His trial began on March the 19th, 1979. The jury found Gene Hart was innocent of the murders. However, he was sent back to prison for the crimes that he had not yet served his sentence for. He died of a heart attack on June the 4th, 1979, after a weightlifting session. Almost every article we read, there is little or no mention of another prime suspect who was mentioned at the trial. He was so instrumental that he is the reason why Gene was acquitted. Waitress Dean Boyd testified that she had seen a nervous man in her diner between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. on the morning of the murders. She said he took his shirt off and kept looking at his hands and boots and was complaining that he had had car trouble. She had called the police as soon as he had left and told them that she was very frightened. He was identified as William Stevens. William Stevens was a convicted rapist who had been spotted around Camp Stevens just a couple of days prior to the murders taking place. His friend and former cellmate Dwayne Peters had told the police that he had loaned William Stevens the very flashlight that was discovered at the murder scene, and also that William Stevens had confessed the murders to him in October 1977. His girlfriend Joyce Payne and her son Larry Short maintained that their story was true. However, she was charged with perjury after a trial had ended with a deadlocked jury. Payne and her son claimed that Williams had arrived to their house on the morning following the murders with scratches on his arms and blood on his shoes. Williams was dropped as a suspect due to the sperm found at the scene not matching the samples that he had provided. But some of the lawyers involved still see Williams as a prime suspect. We may never find out the truth, as Williams was stabbed to death as he was in prison, serving time for kidnapping and rape. In 1996, a private investigator called Ted LaTurner said that he had a witness who could name 3 suspects. The aforementioned William Stevens, along with Frank Justice and his nephew Sonny James, who all had extensive criminal records. Frank Justice had claimed to have seen the writing on the cave wall and was an acquaintance of Hart, and his nephew Sonny later went on to murder in 1984. That wraps up today's episode of The Kill Room. Make sure you hit subscribe, take care of yourselves, and we will see you all on the next episode.